I think most Christians probably know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. They have some vague understanding of what that means and what Hebrew sort of is, but I think there's a lot of mystery to the especially Old Testament text. Like, where did that Hebrew come from? I mean, it was written such a long time ago and by people in a far distant past. And so how did we even get that text? There's also complications of words like the Septuagint and the Vulgate, and there's all this sort of, I think, mystery surrounding the Old Testament text. And so in this series on the Hebrew Bible, we're going to talk about what Hebrew is, how it came to be, and then how all these other versions sort of play into the Hebrew basis of our Old Testament. So join me on this trip into the text of the Hebrew Bible. So I should probably start off by defining some terms. One term we're going to talk about a lot in all of these episodes on the Greek and Hebrew text is manuscript. And manuscript is simply the handwritten document of any kind. You can see it in the word manu, like manual, which means by hand, and then script, which is just simply a text. And so manuscripts, though, are the way that we get any information from the ancient world. I mean, the printing press doesn't really come along until 1600 or so. And before that, there was no copying verbatim text down and making sure it's the exact same every single time. That was done by copyists. It was done by scribes, people who were trained to write. And so all of the text that we have from the ancient world, and specifically the Bible, is manuscripts, and it's dependent on humans, and it's all written by hand. And so we're going to talk about how that sort of works and how that has come down to us today. So before we get into the actual text, though, of the Hebrew, I want to talk about the Hebrew Bible, the ones that the Jewish people use today, and the Bible that is the Old Testament for Christians. And so the Hebrew Bible is actually divided into three parts, and it's called the Tanakh, which is the shorthand for those three parts. So we have first the Torah, which is law, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The second division is the Nevi'im, which is the prophets. And it might surprise you to know that books like Joshua, like Samuel, like Kings are part of that Nevi'im, that prophetic tradition. In addition to books like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and the minor prophets, which we think of a little more as prophetic books. The final set of writing is the Ketuvim, or the writings. And that is Psalm, that's Job, that's Ezra and Nehemiah, some of these books that don't fit into those earlier 2 categories. And the Jewish Bible that is still used today, and the Protestant Bible that most Protestants use is the same, even though the ordering of the books and the numbering is different. For instance, the Jewish Bible puts books like Samuel together instead of a first and second, same way with Kings, Chronicles, but all these books are basically the same in a different order, which actually does make some difference, but basically the same. And so that's how these things are sort of divided. That's how the Old Testament sort of thought about. So the Torah and the Nevi'im would have been pretty early put together. Like, they would have been cemented. They would have been formed pretty early on. Before the time of Christ, these books were pretty much always the same. The Ketuvim, however, it didn't quite come together in its final form until probably the 1st century AD. There's some debate among scholars. There's this supposed Council of Jamnia that some people say happened, where the final form of the Hebrew Bible was taken. Others debate that didn't actually exist. I don't know. I'm not a historian. We'll leave that debate for other YouTube series. But the final form of this Hebrew text was probably done around the 1st century AD. Also during that time, in about 70 AD, a travesty happens, which is the temple is destroyed, and the place of worship is taken away. And so the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, which were already sort of scattered, become even more scattered with widespread persecution, and they're all over the world. And because of that, over the next couple hundred years, Hebrew sort of becomes a language only used by scholars. It's not a common language anymore that most people use. That's Greek, that becomes Greek and Latin, these languages that sort of pass on to us. And so Hebrew falls out of disuse. Because of all that, the Bible can be a little more true to how it was originally written, because of the works of scholars. I don't know if you've ever tried copying anything down, but it is not as easy as it seems. Take a page from your favorite book and just try to copy the text down verbatim. I think and then once you read back through it, I think you'll actually see that it's really easy to make mistakes copying things down. There's, if a word's pretty close to another word, it can be easy to, miss all the words in the middle. It's easy to skip a line sometimes if you're not really paying attention. And because it was only scholars copying down the Hebrew text, only people who were really trained to do copying and to understand the text were the ones doing it. If you had a bunch of people who weren't trained, you could get all sorts of errors in the text. And so probably the loss of the Hebrew language early in the second or third century is probably what led to the Hebrew Bible being as precise as it is even today. It might surprise you to know that the oldest full Hebrew manuscripts that we have are around 1000 AD, which means that there's a couple thousand years difference between when a lot of the Hebrew Bible was actually written and the oldest manuscripts, the oldest handwritten copies that we have today. And so the history of that, of keeping that all together is a really important task. And so I'm going to show you here. Here's my Hebrew Bible. If you've never seen Hebrew, it's a really pretty incredible language. If you'll notice, there are two different types of sort of text in this Bible. There are the larger letters, and then there's sort of points that just kind of are around all the letters. And so Hebrew, when it was first done, was a consonantal text, meaning only the consonants were put into the text. And so the reader would sort of infer the vowels out of context, and because they knew Hebrew and can do that. And so as Hebrew became not a language commonly used, by about the 5th century, a group of scholars called the Masoretes sort of take over the mantle of copying and keeping the Hebrew text the way it is. Inherent in that, though, is this knowledge that was sort of passed down generation to generation about the vowels has no way of sort of getting passed on unless, it's spoken and passed through generations. And so they come up with a tool called vowel pointing that actually puts vowels around the consonantal text that's there. Instead of having to, sort of change all the text and add vowels in, the points can go around the vowels. They also vocalize the text. So they show people how to read it, especially for, religious ceremonies, like keeping that tradition alive of how you read Hebrew, how you approach Hebrew. And so the text that we actually use today, the Hebrew text that is in your translation that you use every single day, is called the Masoretic text, because they are the ones responsible for sort of keeping this text alive, for copying it and keeping it in its original form as much as possible. So the obvious question sort of jumps out, like if there's such a time difference between when the text was written and the copies that we have today, how can we be sure the text is even good or useful or hasn't been changed a bunch throughout the generations? And so something really important happens in 1946, which is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm actually going to do a whole sort of video on the Dead Sea Scrolls talking about what they are. But if you don't know, basically a group of shepherds finds a huge cache of ancient documents around the Dead Sea and all these little caves that are all around there. And they end up being this huge boost to scholarship around the original text, because there are manuscripts dating from a couple of centuries before the time of Christ. Like, this is a huge boost to seeing what the original text actually was. There's Hebrew, there's Greek documents, there's Aramaic documents in there, which is a language very close to Hebrew. And so scholars actually could look at these, early and antique manuscripts and see how close they were to the Hebrew text. And amazingly, the text was extremely close. I mean, there may be variants here and there, but very few variants over 1300 years, and the actual text being copied by hand over all those years. And it's pretty cool that there were scholars devoted to the Hebrew text enough to preserve it throughout these generations. So another question pops up for me, which is, if Hebrew falls out of disuse, the early church is still using the Old Testament somehow. So, before the New Testament's written, that's the scriptures. That's what they're talking about in the New Testament as scripture is the Old Testament. And so next week, we're actually going to do a whole series on the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. We're going to talk about where the Septuagint comes from, how it's used, and how it's even used today by scholars to understand the Hebrew Bible. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you like this video so that you can stay up to date, so that you can find out about the Septuagint. I mean, everybody wants to know about the Septuagint. I'm for sure about that. So make sure you subscribe so you know when the videos come out. It's an awesome lesson. If I missed something in this video, I would love to hear about it. So leave a comment below if there's something that, like, hey, this doesn't make sense, or, I'd like to hear about, something else. Leave that comment. I'm happy to talk about that stuff. This level of nerdery about the Bible is just something that very exciting to me. So I'm always happy to talk about that stuff. Finally, if this is a book that I've been using a lot for, studying the text of the Old Testament. This is a book I actually used in grad school to learn about the text of the Old Testament. So this is a great one. It's Ernst Werthwein's Text of the Old Testament. So if you really want to dig into some of this stuff, this is a great resource. It walks you through the dates of all the different manuscripts that we have. It talks about the Septuagint, the Vulgate, which we'll get into, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So check that out. And yeah, we'll see you next week at Bootleg Bible College.